cette session avec quelques minutes de retard. Nous devons avoir fini pour midi, donc je demanderai aux orateurs de faire des présentations courtes et percutantes, de façon à garder un peu de temps pour quelques questions. Je vais passer la parole maintenant à Cécile Denis, qui bosse à University of Pennsylvania dans le département de psychiatrie et qui va présenter les différents orateurs. Comme vous le verrez dans cette session, la plupart des travaux qui sont présentés sont des travaux qui sont des collaborations franco-américaines et vietnamiennes avec, je pense, des projets absolument passionnants dont certains sont encore en cours ou vont commencer. Et je passe maintenant la parole à Cécile.
Bonjour à tous. Donc, toutes les sessions vont être en anglais. Donc, si vous ne comprenez pas l'anglais, il faut prendre un traducteur. So, our first speaker will be Todd KORTHUIS, who is a researcher and professor of psychiatry at University in New York, and he's going to present some data about the DRIVE study.
I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. Many people came from a far distance and are sort of living in different time zones, and the conference seems to be on its own time zone anyway. So I do want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'll be talking about the DRIVE study, which is drug use and infections in Vietnam. It is a very large study with many, many organizations working on it, and many researchers working on it. We try to have at least one researcher for every 50 subjects. Okay. And combined prevention and care for people who inject drugs has been very successful in many high-income settings. The combined prevention includes syringe service programs, methadone maintenance, antiretroviral treatment for HIV positives. For the DRIVE study, we used New York as an example of how to bring an epidemic under control. Originally in New York, there was about a 60% prevalence of HIV among people who inject drugs. And in 1990, just before we implemented syringe exchange programs, incidence was 4 per 100 person years at risk. Incidence is now down to 0.4 per 100 person years at risk, so a 99% reduction in HIV incidence. And we measured that through cohort studies, through newly identified cases, and through math modeling. So, and we had consistency across all of those data sources. But there are special concerns about trying to end HIV epidemics in low and middle income countries. Those include the obvious limited financial resources, the limited numbers of trained personnel, the often limited research capacity for doing epidemiology, and the severe stigmatization of both HIV and injecting drug use. This leads to difficulties in both reaching PWID to provide services and to recruiting them for research studies. And then there are also the counterproductive practices, such as incarceration of PWID in prisons and detention centers, which both is a function of the stigmatization and reinforces the stigmatization and makes recruiting people for both services and research much more difficult. We worked in the city of Hai Phong, Vietnam. It's a city of 2 million. It's the major port for the northern part of the country. HIV prevalence was 66% in 2006. But it has a number of prevention programs. Methadone maintenance treatment began in 2006. Pharmacy sales of sterile syringes have always been available, and syringe exchange has been added to that. And in 2014, there was a government policy of providing ART for all HIV seropositives. And in particular in Hai Phong, we had strong community-based organizations of former and current PWID that we worked with. We conducted a preliminary feasibility study in 2014 with an N of 603. At that time, prevalence was 25%, and our estimated incidence was 1 to 2 per 100 person-years at risk. We decided that we would be very, very much upfront about what we meant for ending an HIV epidemic among PWID. We wanted to reduce incidence to 0.5 per 100 person-years at risk. We wanted to reduce the percentage of HIV seropositive PWID not at viral suppression to 7.5% of the total PWID population in the city of Hai Phong. We wanted to reduce the percentage of HIV seropositive PWID not at viral suppression and engaging in distributive sharing of their needles and syringes to 2% of the population or less. So this is the group that would be capable of transmitting HIV on to others through sharing needles. We made a public commitment to these criteria, both in terms of publishing the protocol in clinicaltrials.gov and a paper in The Lancet last year. Okay. As part of this study, we needed to do very, very large surveys of PWID. We wanted to identify large numbers of PWID in need of services so that we could assist them in accessing those services. Our community-based organizations were fundamental in terms of getting people into services, both ART and methadone, and providing syringes and condoms to them. And we wanted to follow large numbers of HIV seronegative so that we could measure HIV incidence with precision. Again, we had a goal of 0.5 per 100 person-years at risk for incidence. And so to measure that with a reasonable amount of precision, we needed to follow large numbers of HIV seronegatives. We used respondent-driven sampling to recruit large numbers, starting with standard RDS methods. We recruited seeds among people who had large PWID networks. They participated in the survey, and then they were given numbered coupons to recruit additional PWID. They were paid for their time and effort and also paid for recruiting new study participants. And again, we were working in collaboration with our community-based organizations to assist in seed identification and RDS recruitment and survey administration. When we did these surveys, we obtained fingerprints from all of the respondents. We did that so that we'd be able to identify people across the surveys and so that we could eliminate any multiple participation by the same individual in the surveys. Because we had former users working with us, they were the ones who actually took the fingerprints on the fingerprint machine, and we had no trouble obtaining fingerprints from our participants. We used 3 coupons per participant, the standard RDS procedure, and that worked until we got up to about 800 participants in each study. Then we ran into problems recruiting more people, and we switched to what we called super recruiters. We would interview new participants coming in, and if they said they didn't think they could recruit anybody for the study, we didn't give them coupons. But if we found people who said they could recruit a lot of new participants, we would give them up to 20 coupons. This shows our recruitment over weeks of the study for each of the 3 large surveys. You can see that we started off very, very well with over 200 participants recruited per week in the first several weeks, and then around week 5, recruitment fell off dramatically, and then that's when we adopted the super recruiter strategy. Recruitment then bumped back up, and we were able to get very close to our target of 1,500 participants for each of the 3 surveys. The reasons why we had trouble recruiting are sort of standard. There was police suppression of the hotspots, which limited contacts PWID had with each other. There was transportation issues to the research site. There was concern about maintaining confidentiality of drug use. And they obviously had other competing interests in their life other than participating in a research study. Because we switched from standard RDS methods to using super recruiters, we did not do RDS weighting, and we treated each of these as a convenient sample. We did calculate RDS diagnostics, homophilies, and reaching equilibria for each of the 3 rounds of surveys, and all of these came out very well. The homophilies were quite low, and we reached equilibria very quickly in either 2 to 3 waves of the surveys. After we did our surveys, we would recruit survey participants to participate in cohort studies, and in particular, we had a group of HIV seronegatives. We eventually recruited almost 900 seronegative in our seronegative cohort from the 3 different RDS super recruiter surveys. We had visits scheduled every 6 months. 766 had at least 1 follow-up visit. We also looked at HIV incidence through people who repeated participation in the 3 large surveys. Each survey allowed you to have participated in a previous survey, and as I mentioned, we had fingerprint reading to identify people who participated in 1 or more of the 3 RDS surveys. There were 281 people who participated in 1 or more of the 3 RDS surveys who generated 377 person years at risk. Among these people, there were no HIV seroconversions. In the cohort studies, there was 1 HIV seroconversion among the 766 participants who generated 1,120 person years at risk. So our overall incidence was under 0.1 per 100 person years at risk. We did meet our criteria for ending the HIV epidemic among PWID and Hai Phong. Our stated goal was incidence of 0.5. We actually had 0.1 per 100 person years at risk in our HIV incidence. We wanted to reduce the percentage of PWID not at viral suppression to 7.5%. In our latest data, it's now actually down to 3.1%, and we've reached the 90-90-90 goals for HIV testing, ART treatment, and viral suppression. And in terms of reducing the number of PWID who are not at viral suppression and engaged in passing on used needles and syringes, our target was 2%, and we're actually down to less than 1%. So the next step for the DRIVE protocol is completion of final cohort visits, and we have another large RDS study with a desired sample size of 1,500 that starts this month. We are concerned with changes in the in-country funding for MMT and ART as foreign donor support is withdrawn. We want to make sure that people don't drop out of the system and remain in methadone and at viral suppression. We're particularly concerned with increased methamphetamine use. We're now up to 50% of our people who inject heroin also using methamphetamine. And we've found that use of methamphetamine is associated with reduced viral suppression, and it also generates aggression, which tends to cause problems in the methadone clinics and working with people in the community. And we are concerned with a potential new outbreak of HIV, that we feel we've accomplished something that has not been done in any low middle income country to date, but if something should go wrong, it would be a tremendous setback for the field if HIV resurged in Hai Phong. Our next step includes taking the drive methods to other locations. We're planning on working in Neon province, which is the large central province in the northern part of Vietnam. We would do a rapid assessment. Then we would do a large-scale RDS or RDS super recruiter study to estimate the population size, to do HIV recency testing, and assess potential bias in the RDS, and a comparison of RDS versus super recruited components. If our criteria for an end of an HIV epidemic is met in Neon, then we will focus on maintaining our programmatic efforts, ART, MMTP, and syringe services. If the criteria for ending the HIV epidemic are not met in Neon, we will work with our community-based organizations to get more PWID into services the same way we did in Hai Phong. Okay, so the lessons so far from DRIVE. First, it is possible to end an HIV epidemic among PWID in a middle-income setting. Second, there's a need for maintenance of efforts. Just because you've gotten to a desirable situation doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way. And then third, we need to transfer the DRIVE methods to other areas in Vietnam and elsewhere. And then here, for the record, are the various DRIVE publications. Okay, thank you.
The question at the end.
Okay.
J'invite Karine Lacombe à monter à la tribune. Karine est professeure de maladies infectieuses à Paris et elle travaille depuis de nombreuses années au Vietnam. Je profite de l'occasion parce que je ne l'ai pas fait pour me présenter. Donc je suis Gilles Raguin, je suis infectiologue et j'ai aussi travaillé depuis de nombreuses années sur des projets de lutte contre le VIH au Vietnam. Nous prendrons toutes les questions à la fin de la session, si vous voulez bien. Hein, c'est ce que tu as prévu, Cécile. Et nous allons donc passer la parole maintenant.
Okay, our next speaker will be Dr. KORTHUIS for Portland, Oregon, and he's going to present some data on the integration of HIV and addiction care within the same clinic from the study of the Bravo study.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for the invitation to come speak today. I have no financial disclosures. This study that I'm going to present was funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. I am serving as principal investigator on studies that accept donated study medications from Alkermes and Indivior. So the rationale for integrating HIV and addiction care really is grounded in the very high prevalence of substance use in HIV clinics in many countries. But access to treatment in many of these places is also limited. UNAIDS recommends either buprenorphine or methadone as a strategy for helping achieve 90-90 goals, or 90% of people diagnosed, 90% of those on antiretroviral therapy, and 90% achieving viral suppression. So how does substance use, and particularly opioid use, play into this? It basically affects each of these stages of 90-90-90, and we hope that intervening on the opioid use with buprenorphine or methadone can interrupt this pathway and improve HIV viral suppression. There have been other studies looking at this. The largest was an observational study of 11 HIV clinics in the US. And at 12 months of integrated buprenorphine and HIV care, heroin and opioid use decreased. There was an increase in ART uptake. There was no change in viral suppression, but there was improved quality of care and quality of life. There was also a single-site pilot randomized controlled trial of buprenorphine versus referral to off-site methadone in one center. And at 12 months, there was a decrease in heroin use and no change in antiretroviral use or viral suppression compared with methadone. And so we devised a multi-site study randomizing people to either integrated clinic-based buprenorphine or referral to methadone that was typically housed in the same building as the HIV clinic. Our primary outcomes that we were interested in were HIV viral suppression at 12 months and antiretroviral therapy receipt as secondary and heroin use. Today, I'm going to only present the preliminary analysis. This is as of this week on only the first 6 months of data. And I'm going to present intent to treat results. Our study sites were in Hanoi, Bắc Giang, and Thanh Hoa provinces. You can see around these areas. They were quite a ways away from Hai Phong, related to our last speaker. In some ways, I wish they were closer. The intervention in the integrated buprenorphine group consisted of prescriptions for buprenorphine by the HIV clinic doctor who had been trained to prescribe buprenorphine, and directly observed therapy at the clinic pharmacy, which sometimes was the methadone dispensary as well. After about 1 month of stabilization on buprenorphine daily dosing, patients were allowed to take 3 times a week or 4 times a week dosing of buprenorphine. And they received for counseling only medical management counseling from their physician. The counseling resources in many of these clinics were extremely limited. And of course, they received HIV treatment. In the methadone arm, they received the referral to the methadone clinic provider that was typically on site for all their addiction management, and also received directly observed therapy with daily dosing. And then continued to receive HIV treatment if they chose to engage in HIV care. So our baseline participant characteristics, we had a mean age of 38 years. The majority of participants, actually nearly all of the participants were male, 96%. And a third of participants were married, which is a marker of less social support in Vietnam studies. They were very experienced with HIV, with an average of 7.5 years since their last diagnosis, and a mean CD4 count of 405 cells. 68% were already on antiretroviral therapy at baseline, There were very high arrest histories, 83%, which is actually comparable to treatment cohorts entering treatment in the US. And 61% had been sent to an O6 rehabilitation center. Methamphetamine use was common, around 19%, and almost everyone smoked. There was no difference statistically between the buprenorphine and methadone group, with the exception of there was a little bit more amphetamine use in the buprenorphine randomized arm. Our retention so far at 6 months was good. In the study, we have study outcomes for 82% of people in the buprenorphine arm and 88% in the methadone arm at 6 months. Retention on medication I wish was better, but was okay, and actually not too different from what we see in clinical populations in the US. I'm curious to hear how it is in France here. But at 6 months, approximately 60% of people remained on buprenorphine and 67% remained on methadone. This was not statistically significant thus far. Heroin use decreased for both buprenorphine and also for methadone, not to 0, but to 44% in the buprenorphine arm and 57% in the methadone arm. And remember, this is intent to treat. This doesn't account for people who were falling off of treatment. There was no statistical significant difference, but that's a fairly large gap. Antiretroviral prescription was superior for those in the methadone group compared with those in the buprenorphine group, which is surprising and not what we expected. And again, intent to treat results. Antiretroviral adherence was similar between the two groups. And HIV viral suppression was superior in the methadone group compared with the buprenorphine group, 51% versus 71% at 6 months. So I'm very much hoping that the 12-month results will be greatly improved, but this is the trajectory we're on so far, and it raises many questions. I went back and revisited the conceptual model that we included in our grant, and I think, not surprisingly, the situation is much more complicated than a causal pathway of the 90-90-90 goals. I think we are dealing primarily with retention in treatment as the main driver of the difference that we're seeing, and that we need to, in the next phase, really drill down on concepts like family support, incarceration, methamphetamine use, a host of other social determinants of health that we will be able to study in our extensive qualitative interviews that have been conducted. So in conclusion, heroin use decreased for both buprenorphine and methadone. HIV care outcomes were less favorable for the buprenorphine group than the methadone group due to less treatment initiation and retention. That integrating buprenorphine and naloxone into HIV primary care is feasible. However, it may require additional support to achieve UNAIDS 90-90-90 goals. And as Vietnam thinks about scale-up of buprenorphine, I think it's helpful to consider the additional supports that will be needed to achieve successful national rollout. These may include family supports and community health worker supports and other levers that improve the social determinants of health and retention and engagement and care. We've had many implementation lessons learned as well, and this is the short list. Multiple addiction medicine training and technical assistance visits were conducted with the involved clinics, and stakeholders and community members and Ministry of Health and community peers. And I think if I had the opportunity to do it again, we would do even more. The other thing is that 3 times a day and 4 times per week, 3 to 4 times per week, buprénorphine dosing was a big motivator for people entering the study. They highly valued that option because it allowed them to work more than the daily appearances at the methadone clinic. So I'm hopeful that one day future possibilities will include take-home doses in Vietnam. And then I think we've all learned about the importance of peers and family members in recruitment and retention, and that will be another major focus as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Our next speaker will be Dr. Gavin BART from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he's going to talk about pharmacokinetics of methadone and HIV treatment.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference, and I'm appreciative of the audience here. I also am thrilled to be part of such a dynamic international collaboration, and have enjoyed the years of working with various people in Vietnam, with Todd, with Don, and others, Jean-Pierre, whom I first met in Vietnam. From the first 2 speakers, you learned how important injection drug use is for HIV in Vietnam, and they discuss interventions that they have done to help reduce that or improve the situation. My presentation is going to be more of an observational study, not an interventional study, but an observational study with the hopes of ultimately improving our approach to addiction treatment in Vietnam with people who are HIV infected and on antiretroviral treatment. I don't have any financial conflicts of interest to report, and I have wonderful collaborators in Vietnam, Oregon, and Minnesota that I am working with on this project. So injection drug use, despite all of the efforts in Hai Phong, remains the largest cause of incident HIV throughout the country of Vietnam. So it's an incredibly important issue, and injection drug use is almost exclusively heroin use. Methamphetamine is rising in Vietnam, but it tends to be smoked rather than injected. The United States and other multilateral partners engaged in a significant amount of assistance to Vietnam to help address the HIV epidemic. The United States President's emergency plan for AIDS relief entered the country in about 2003 or 4 and initiated needle syringe programs, which you can see began to lower the incidence of HIV, and then with the introduction of methadone in 2008, there were further reductions. Now, the introduction of antiretrovirals for people who are HIV infected in a country that primarily uses methadone to treat opioid use disorder. There are currently about 53,000 people on methadone in Vietnam. Buprénorphine remains a pilot project, so it's not yet been widely disseminated. we have significant interactions between antiretrovirals and methadone, which creates the potential to destabilize patients, as these interactions can lead to precipitated withdrawal, and precipitated withdrawal can lead to ongoing drug use and therefore increasing the risk of ongoing transmission factors, or resulting in people dropping out of treatment, both their HIV and their methadone treatment, in order to address their withdrawal symptoms. So developing models that can help improve or reduce the impact of drug-drug interactions is potentially an important mechanism of reducing destabilization. So in Vietnam, we can see that people who are on antiretrovirals and methadone versus those who are not on antiretrovirals tend to have twice the dose requirements of methadone due to these drug-drug interactions. And in the bottom panel, ongoing drug use is higher in the patients with antiretroviral use, likely related to some inherent risk factors of those who are HIV infected, but also probably related to the drug-drug interactions. What's intrigued me is that in studies evaluating people who are on methadone and initiate antiretroviral therapy, there's a wide variety of reactions to antiretroviral therapy. So the panel on the upper left side shows people who are on methadone and start antiretroviral therapy and tracks what happens to their methadone dose requirements through time. And in many people, you see that there is a drug-drug interaction that results in a need for increased methadone dose, but it's highly variable. Some people's methadone dose increases only 30%, some by more than 100%, and we even see one person where there's no change in their methadone dose requirements after starting antiretrovirals. And so, to me, this inter-individual variability is fascinating. And why does it exist? And are there ways that we can help better understand this inter-individual variability? So what has motivated me for this study is, if we take, for example, two individuals who seemingly are the same, both of the same age, both using the same amount of heroin with the same frequency of injections in a given day, yet you can have one who's on 85 milligrams of methadone daily and doing well, no withdrawal, no craving, no drug use, and another person who's on 115 milligrams of methadone daily, but still using, still craving. Why are these two people, who are seemingly very similar, having different results of their treatment? Now, certainly psychosocial factors are playing a role, but I think more biologically. And so I wanted to explore this from a pharmacokinetic standpoint to see whether drug-drug interactions with methadone and antiretroviral medications might be playing a factor in this. So this is an exploratory observational study with an attempt to build a model of antiretroviral and methadone drug-drug interactions. And it's using a methodology called population pharmacokinetics to create this model of drug-drug interactions. Now, traditionally, when pharmacokinetics of any drug are done, their patients are given their medication, and over a series of time intervals, blood is drawn, and the levels or concentrations of that drug in their plasma is measured through time. These are very labor-intensive studies, and almost by necessity, they're very small sample size. 8 to 12 people, because you're drawing blood every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every hour, for sometimes up to 24 hours. It has to be done in inpatient settings. And so this creates a huge limitation in terms of the generalizability. One, especially for drug users, are they willing to be able to go into an inpatient setting? Can they, because of repeat injection drug use, are their veins healthy enough for repeat blood draws? And another factor is when you have a sample size of only 8 to 12, as most traditional pharmacokinetic studies have, it's basically impossible to work in covariates into the analysis to really understand what's influencing variability in pharmacokinetics between people. So population pharmacokinetics is a different approach. Rather than doing intensive every 15 and 30-minute blood draws on individuals, you can have many individuals for which you draw only a few blood samples each. And you can compile across a population a model of pharmacokinetics that relatively approximates the intensive pharmacokinetic testing that you would do traditionally. But by having large numbers of people, covariates can now be worked into the model to better understand the inter-individual variability. This is an increasingly common approach because it allows a real-world population. They don't have to be in a special research center. You don't need to filter out your population on set criteria. And you can pool results regardless of whether someone missed the given day's dose of their medication or not. So as an example, if you had a plot of concentrations over time for a number of individuals, what you would normally try to do is approximate the best line for these concentrations and try to minimize or figure out the residual sum of squares here to come up with the best fitting line. Now, for traditional pharmacokinetics, this is what you can do, but population, imagine what happens when you have a situation of a similar plot, but suddenly you've got men and women as different covariates. Adjusting for the covariates, suddenly there are different lines that better fit the model with reduced residual sum of squares. So you can keep doing this by adding more and more covariates to find the minimum number of residual sum of squares and identify how various covariates impact your approximation of things like drug clearance or volume of distribution. And so that's sort of the framework that informs this approach that I used in this study. Now, I've used this approach in another context, just as a preliminary background to show that this approach can work for methadone. In a clinic that I have in Minneapolis, I have a fair number of people who are refugees from Laos. They're an ethnic minority known as the Hmong. And we observed that our Hmong population had really significantly greater retention in methadone treatment compared to our non-Hmong population, yet they were able to have this better treatment outcome on lower doses of methadone. And that's counterintuitive. Traditionally, we think of methadone treatment outcome as being related to dose requirement and that people on higher doses do better. And this was a situation where it was just the opposite. People on lower doses were doing better. So we built a pharmacokinetic model and we included ethnicity, some genotype information, and other factors into the model, and in fact showed that methadone clearance was reduced by 30% in people who were Hmong. And so what that meant is that the Hmong could consume lower doses of methadone and get the same area under the curve in terms of concentrations as non-Hmong because of this alteration in clearance. So there was a biological explanation for why this population could do well on a lower dose. We also identified a couple of genetic polymorphisms across the population that influenced methadone clearance, a P-glycoprotein polymorphism that reduced clearance by 20% of both the R and the S enantiomers of methadone, and then a cytochrome P452B6 polymorphism that reduced methadone clearance only for the S-methadone by about 20%. And so this approach is possible in a methadone population, and it can identify covariates that significantly impact methadone pharmacokinetics. So for the Vietnam study, we hypothesized, there were a number of hypotheses, but I'm only going to present today on the initial one, which is that patients who are on either nevirapine or efavirenz as part of their antiretroviral regimen would see a reduction in their clearance of methadone, both for R and S enantiomers. we're currently running the DNA, so hopefully perhaps next time I can come to this conference and present some of the genetic covariates. Now, this was a selection of patients already on methadone. This was based at several clinics in Hanoi. The criteria were patients had to be at least 18 years of age, on methadone, and if they were on antiretroviral treatment, they had to be on a regimen that included either nevirapine or efavirenz, which is the overwhelming majority of people in Vietnam. Those are the backbones of antiretroviral treatment in that country. People were excluded if they were in their second or third trimester of pregnancy or had end-stage liver disease, such as signified by having cirrhosis and ascites. There were both cross-sectional components and longitudinal prospective components where some people had repeat measurements over a series of 6 months, and other people only had single measurements a few hours apart of their methadone plasma levels. All data for people, whether it was cross-sectional or prospective, were pooled. We collected demographic data, medical history. We did measurements of clinical opioid withdrawal scale, height, weight for body mass index calculation, measured adherence to antiretroviral, did the assist light to look at a risk level for ongoing substance use, and measured depression using the CESD. And we tested both R and S enantiomers of methadone, including total and the unbound fractions of methadone, CD4 count, viral load, and as a pilot, we're also looking at levels of nevirapine and efavirenz, although those won't be presented today. Baseline characteristics, we had 153 HIV positive individuals, 155 HIV negative individuals. Again, everyone is already on methadone. It's a young population. It's typical in Vietnam, where over 95% of methadone patients in Vietnam are male. The dosing differences, about twice the dose requirements of the HIV positive individuals versus the HIV negative. Some statistically significant differences, although not really clinically significant in terms of body mass index. The COWS score. COWS scores 8 and above are considered the starting point for withdrawal. So even though there's a significant difference between the HIV negative and HIV positive, none of the people are in withdrawal. And depression, in terms of the percentage of depression, no significant difference there. The majority of people who are HIV positive were on antiretrovirals, and most of the population was virally suppressed. Looking at the modeling, just looking at individual predicted methadone concentrations versus the observed for both R and S, total and unbound, the models found fairly good predictive ability between what we observed and what we would have guessed. This is just traditional population pharmacokinetic data presentation for visual predictive checks to make sure that our means and 5th and 95th percentile confidence intervals are matching the population, and they appear to be doing well for both the total and unbound. Perhaps some of the higher levels of the unbound, we're seeing a little bit of a difference. Getting to the preliminary results for both the R and the S, the modeling approach can combine total and unbound into sort of an assumption-free model and then matches the best fit, and the best fit actually ended up being for unbound. So for those of you who are used to seeing clearance and volume of distribution for total methadone, these numbers are very unusual to you because these are based on unbound, but from the basic literature using traditional pharmacokinetics of intensive sampling, our numbers for clearance and volume of distribution are pretty consistent for unbound levels with a clearance of 260 liters per hour and a volume of distribution of 16,000 liters for unbound methadone. But really, in terms of initiating or looking at covariates, what we found is that if you were on antiretroviral therapy, Vietnam had, for the most part, phased out nevirapine, so this is based on efavirenz, is that efavirenz will increase methadone clearance twofold. And quite interestingly, and this is perhaps the first study to demonstrate it, so it's exciting to see, is that independent of antiretroviral therapy, HIV itself, just having an infection of HIV reduces the bioavailability of methadone by about 20%. And so that's another factor that perhaps even makes us think of methadone dose needs in those who have yet to be on antiretroviral therapy, that the HIV infection may further reduce bioavailability of methadone. Looking at the S methadone, we see very similar results, where 2.5-fold increase in clearance of methadone if you're on efavirenz, and another 20% decrease in oral bioavailability for methadone. So next steps, we're going to refine the model. We're going to add more covariates as this approach allows covariates to be introduced. We're cleaning up the data on methamphetamine use, and we'll add that as a covariate, viral hepatitis status, and the DNA is being run. There are some specific polymorphisms that we're interested in, one in particular that we think will be very specific to a drug-drug interaction between methadone and efavirenz. This hopefully will lead to a point where we can do therapeutic drug monitoring, where we can actually adjust methadone dose based on predicted need, and therefore engage in rational dosing and take some of the guesswork out of methadone dosing. So that's ultimately where we hope to head. We aren't there yet, but I do hope that these two individuals who are seemingly so different that I introduced at the beginning, we will have an explanation for why they're different and what we can do to adjust their therapy to minimize that difference. So thank you, and I look forward to presenting this as the study is ongoing.
Merci beaucoup pour cette avant-dernière présentation, et je propose à M. Livio AZZONI de Philadelphie de venir pour la dernière présentation pour nous parler des effets de l'engagement du récepteur myopiacé sur la translocation microbienne et l'activation immunitaire résiduelle chez des patients infectés par le VIH. Donc, ce sera également une dernière présentation en anglais. And then we will open the discussion, either in French or in English.
It's only in English. Mon français n'est pas très bon. Thanks, everybody. Thank you particularly for the organizer for inviting us to present some of our data, but mostly the study design for the study that are upcoming. This long title essentially summarizes our interest in pathogenesis of HIV and specifically the effect of opioid use on the pathogenesis itself. I will give a brief introduction covering this and then present the results of a small pilot study that we have done in Philadelphia, and then go on to present the structure for the studies that we have funded, have been recently funded, and we are going to implement in the upcoming months, both in Vietnam and in Philadelphia, two very different studies with different goals, but interlinked. So I guess, talking to the pew here, so everybody knows that there's an interaction between opioid use disorder and HIV. In opioid use disorder, increasing risk of exposure, increasing behavior that might lead to exposure, economic instability, co-infection that might promote HIV infection as well. Whereas on the other side, HIV-infected people often have chronic pain that require management, and particularly in the US is often managed with opioid. And there are co-occurring mental health diagnoses and so on can lead to the use of opioids. Just very quickly, I don't want to go over all the receptors, but I wanted to point out that the opioid binding to the receptor, any of the receptor really, can lead to alteration of the gut motility. And it's one of the central part of our hypothesis. What happens in the gut? And this is all biology, so I guess we all know that the engaging, particularly the mu receptor, but all the receptor, with opioids, opiates, or whatever we use, leads to a decrease in the motility and an increase of the tone throughout the entire intestine. In addition to that, there are issues with the bile secretion, gallbladder contraction, and even the composition of the bile acids that can have a profound effect on the microbiome of the individual. This is not being studied in details in humans, but in mice, in murine models, there are clear evidence that opioid administration in the form of morphine leads to changes in the microbiome with a shift toward a pro-inflammatory flora. Why does this matter? Before that, there are also effects directly the engagement of the opioid receptor on immune effectors. So immune effectors such as T cells and innate immune effectors such as macrophages are modified, at least in vitro, by the engagement of the mu receptor. And this leads to, generally speaking, pro-inflammatory responses. In addition to that, there is a possibility, and it's not really clearly demonstrated yet, but there's a possibility that engagement of the receptor can promote the transcription of HIV in a cell that has already been infected. And this is probably through the CRAB pathway and engagement on NF-kappa B. So there are plenty of reasons to think that there's an interaction between the opioid and the HIV on the pathogenesis side. What leads HIV here? I put the traditional vicious circle of HIV pathogenesis, HIV replication, and that feeds the reservoir, and at the same time affects the mucosa of the gut that becomes more, it loses integrity, and it allows microbial particles to be transported into the blood flow. And this leads to immune activation and chronic inflammation that also feeds into the replication because, again, of the stimulation from pro-inflammatory cytokines. So this is a circle. When we introduce art in these circles, then we stop the replication. And in the ideal world, this then leads to immune recovery. We know the immune recovery is not always complete. We know there are still alterations of the microbiome that persist for a long time after treating with art. But there is a recovery, certainly, and people do relatively well. However, what happens when the mu receptor comes into play? So here is schematized, the two different things that we can do to the receptor. We can block it or we can stimulate it. And so looking at agonists, the methadone is the pure agonist that we have in clinic right now, and Suboxone is a partial agonist. And so the hypothesis here would be that by stimulating the receptor, because of all the pathogenesis that I've described before, this would lead to an increase in dysbiosis that would then feed into the circle, increasing inflammation and potentially leading to enhanced HIV replication. Using naltrexone on the other side, which is a pure antagonist, should theoretically stop the circle and allow for a better immune recovery and treatment. Now, if this is true, then the hypothesis would be that people that have been treated that are on ART, so HIV-infected, treated with antiretroviral, if we just look across the border, people that are currently receiving treatment with naltrexone would have a better immune recovery than people that receive agonists. And we tested this in a small pilot that we did in Philadelphia. This was very limited. We had no funding whatsoever, so we just gathered all, whatever we could do with collaboration with our clinical partners, and we got a small pilot study. We enrolled 13 participants that had long-term methadone treatment, obviously with opioid use disorder, and also 14 people that had relatively shorter treatment with naltrexone. I'll get into that. And then we had controls that had HIV infection, but no opioid use disorder and no use of any agonist or antagonist of the receptor. So underneath here, you can see the cohort characteristics. And I just want to point out that everything was similar except the time on treatment with substitution or the blocking of the receptor. And this was significantly different. Part of it is historic. The patients we had on methadone had been on methadone for a very long time, and since times in which naltrexone wasn't actually available. And typically our patients on naltrexone are not long-term treatment, so they were like, around the 2-year mark or so. So this would be a caveat in the interpretation, but what did we observe? First, what did we measure? We were really interested in a number of markers, so we look at immune activation, we look at a lot of different markers, but the main one we were interested in is soluble CD14 because it's been shown to actually be a biomarker for progression and morbidity and mortality in HIV. And this is summarized here in the slides. As you can see here, people in the upper quartiles of soluble CD14 in the plasma have a much worse survival probability than people that are in the lower quartile. So soluble CD14 is a marker of activation of the innate system. It comes mostly from monocytes and macrophages, but it's also a marker of microbial translocation engaging the toll receptor. So we concentrated on this marker, and here are the results for this marker. And then this really, the core of our preliminary results from the pilot is that, as expected from our hypothesis, individuals that received methadone and have been treated for a long time with methadone and well suppressed had much higher levels of soluble CD14 than individuals that either were controlled, not receiving, not OUD, no treatment for opioid, or individuals with that were receiving naltrexone. We wanted to, as you can see here, there weren't very many differences in activation, both from the T cell side of the innate immunity side, and also in terms of cell-associated HIV DNA and RNA, we didn't observe any difference. But it's a very small sample, so small differences would not be noticeable in this particular cross-sectional study. So we went a step further because we were concerned about the time on treatment, because obviously immune reconstitution is a function of time, and so having people that have been in treatment for a short time wasn't ideal. So we actually modeled this in an approach. This is, again, a linear model. Thanks for the previous speaker for introducing the concept, but we just look at the effect of time on treatment with the substitution therapy or with naltrexone on the results. And we saw that there was a significant effect for the time of treatment, but the effect of the treatment itself was also still significant after adjusting for time. And this was true both for soluble CD14, which was our main outcome, but also for the activation of CD8 positive T cells, which is also a marker of disease progression and chronic inflammation. So just to summarize, individuals receiving methadone at higher immune activation and potentially more microbial translocation than individuals receiving naltrexone, all things equal. So this led, obviously, it's a conclusion, but it also leads to a lot of questions. Number one, obviously, is this causative, because this is a cross-sectional study, so we don't know what is associated with what in terms of causation. And also, what are the mechanisms that underlay this observation? Is there, in fact, non-activation as we expect of the innate immune system? And this is what led to the design, and we applied for grants and finally found funding for the design of the two studies that I'm going to present. And they're under this umbrella of AMOHI. The first one I'm going to talk about is a longitudinal RCT, and this is really, the purpose is to address the causation. And it's the gold standard for longitudinal RCT. This will be done in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and we'll present the structure at the end. But this is just the study design. So we will screen individuals with opioid use disorder that are HIV co-infected and are not treated, and they're about to start antiretroviral treatment. So at the time in which they start antiretroviral treatment, they will be randomized, and we will randomize 75 patients in each of these three groups, one group receiving methadone, one group receiving Suboxone, and one group receiving naltrexone. I want to mention here that this will be done in collaboration with Dr. Metzger group and with Cécile Denis here. We have a long-term experience already with studies in Vietnam in this particular clinic that we're going to use, the GoVap clinic, and therefore, and they have implemented and demonstrated that, the effectiveness of the Suboxone intervention there. So we will use their approach, which was very successful. It couples treatment, pharmacological treatment with counseling. So we will do an induction period, and I have to say I made a mistake here. Obviously, we will not detox people that go into methadone. We will detox people that go into naltrexone, and the other people will have a dose adjustment. This will be a period of about 2 weeks, and then we will start the observation period with the hope of having 50 participants in each arm for analysis at the end. And we'll touch on the analysis lately, but we have intensive biological sampling and also, of course, adherence and safety assessments. So in terms of the clinical intervention, so the assessments are going to be aimed at, addiction severity, depression, and we will do urine drug screen tests to see if there's continued use over time, and treatment satisfaction questionnaires and so on. The medication, just want to mention that we have planned to use the extended release naltrexone. We're still in negotiation with the company, and therefore it might be that we might end up using oral naltrexone, but the plan for now is to use extended release. And finally, the support is the CBT-based behavioral drug and risk counseling approach, which again is the child of Dr. Metzger and Cécile Denis. And I don't really have anything to say about this because I don't understand anything about it, but it's very intensive, and hopefully somebody has any question that can address them directly there. The analysis, the strategies here, we try to have a very comprehensive, so as I mentioned, we're interested in pathogenesis. So we certainly value the clinical outcome of the approach, but we need to gather information about immunopathogenesis. So we know that there's going to be a loss of patients, particularly it's expected to be in the naltrexone arm, people that might not detox successfully, they might choose at a certain point not to receive that medication and so on. So to take care of this, we will allow switches during the induction and immediately after the induction, so that people that cannot continue on one arm, that will be allowed to switch on another arm. And this will potentially, first of all, get more people into treatment, and second, allow us to have observation for a long period of time with the medications that we're interested in. And so in intent to treat analysis, this patient that switch will be failed as expected, but we will do an exposed analysis, so as treated, in which this patient will be incorporated to the arm in which they switched to. What we're going to look at. So this is a slew of variables, so I don't want to be too tedious about it, but we're going to have clinical variables, of course, to assess the intervention itself, such as retention into care, the CD4 count as a marker of immune reconstitution, continued drug use, acceptability of the treatment, and so on. In terms of virology, we're interested in two main things. So obviously viral suppression, but we're also interested in see if there is residual viral transcription induced potentially through the NF-κB mechanism by the stimulation of the mu receptor. So we will look at cell-associated DNA and RNA, all the species of RNA, to see how far the transcription happens in the transcriptional indexes. In terms of other variables, if you remember here the vicious circle, so based on that, we will look to assess the microbial translocation. We will look at microbial products, LPS, endocap. We will look at intestinal markers of intestinal integrity, such as IFAB, clouding, occluding, and so on, which are markers that essentially tell us if the wall of the intestinal mucosa is damaged and therefore facilitating microbial translocation. The microbial translocation itself will be assessed by looking at the S16 rDNA, which is the ribosomal RNA. This is unique to bacteria. And then the most innovative part is here we will look at, by PCR, we will look at the butyryl-CoA transferase in the stool. And this is a measure of, it's a generic measure of the number of species, once it's normalized, and the number of species that can produce butyrate, which has been associated with an anti-inflammatory flora. So the ratio of this will give us an idea as to whether there is a switch toward a less pro-inflammatory flora with the treatment, and whether this is different in the three arms. In terms of inflammation immune activation, again, it's a slew of things, but essentially what we're targeting is markers of adaptive responses, so memory T cells, activation, and so on and so forth. We will look at markers of innate immunity, and particularly we're targeting monocytes and macrophages at this point. There's a lot of soluble markers that we can also look at, and there will be mostly the pro-inflammatory chemokines. We will look at cytokines, and we will try to get a complete picture of the inflammation and immune activation. And finally, I already touched on the replication markers. The first study, I'm going to go very quickly because we're out of time almost, but just to present, this is a cross-section study, so we're looking at causation. So this is really heavy on variables, not so much. So we're going to get, in Philadelphia, through our collaborating clinics, 30 patients receiving methadone and ART, Suboxone and ART, naltrexone and ART, and finally people without opioid use disorder receiving only ART, and we'll compare this. We will do both blood and tissue sampling in these patients, and then this is just an enormous list of variables that we'll look at, but again, we're targeting all the things that we target in the others, in the longitudinal trial, but much more in depth, so we're going to have more markers. We're going to have a full display of omics, in which we will look at the immunophenotyping much deeper detail, particularly when it comes to the myeloid sector. And then we will look at more markers of HIV persistence. Specifically, we're interested in inducible P24 protein to have an assessment, potential assessment of the viral reservoir. We might do a PDA test as well. And finally, the other interesting thing is the tissue analysis. We'll do a very in-depth analysis, but this is going to be a single cell level. There are very few cells available, so we're going to do full omics. We're going to use the CyTOF analysis, which is the one based on without using colors, essentially, and allows for the contemporary use of many markers, up to 50 markers for the immune cells. And then we're going to do RNA-seq in order to see the transcriptome of the cells and look if there is a switch to any sign of the TLR in type 1 interferon engagement and signatures. This is just a panel of the mass flow cytometry that we're going to do with, and this is going to be done in collaboration with the New York Mount Sinai University. This is just the acknowledgement very quickly. So the group at Worcester, of course, my boss, Luis Montaner, David Metzer, and Cécile Denis were instrumental in designing the trial, particularly the MOHI-1, and interpreting all of our results in order to have drawing up the plans and writing the grants and so on. So the MOHI-1 would be done in collaboration with EMEA, with Gilles and Vincent Triat. And we will do it in collaboration with the Ho Chi Minh CD PAC, the Institut Pasteur, Daniel Scott-Algar, and the University of Colorado, Cara Wilson is the one who will be doing the butyryl-CoA transferase. The MOHI-2 is going to be done in Philadelphia, so we have a local group. We collaborate with Mount Sinai and our clinical sites. And finally, just to thank NIDA, has been absolutely instrumental in procuring the funding and also helping us walking through all the regulatory steps that will get us to this. And that's a conclusion. Thank you.
We have time. Nous avons du temps pour quelques questions. Donc, si vous avez pour l'un des orateurs des questions, elles sont bienvenues. Questions are welcome. Tu as des questions?
Non, je t'en prie, et puis après je...
Non, non, vas-y.
Bon alors, ça sera plus compréhensible. Donc ça, enfin, au niveau pratique, au niveau clinique, est-ce que ça supposerait que pour nos patients sous méthadone ou sous buprénorphine et avec des antirétroviraux, il faudrait d'emblée les mettre sous probiotiques? C'est la grande mode des probiotiques.
So did you get the question?
You understand?
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there is no real proof that probiotics work.
Attends, Livio. Wait. The microphone.
Oh, sorry. Hello. Unfortunately, there's no real proof that probiotic work. So that, yes, it would, if there was any evidence, very strong evidence that probiotic can lead to a durable change in the microbiome, I think that would probably be true for any HIV-infected patient, whether they have opioid use disorder or not, whether they use treatment. I think there's the change in the flora in HIV is pretty much permanent. So if it were possible to switch it back with probiotics, and believe me, people are trying, I think absolutely it would be a good idea to do that. And it might counterbalance any effect on methadone, assuming that we observe that.
Oui, alors, s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, j'avais une question pour Todd. So I've been really amazed by your preliminary results. Oh, sorry. So I've been really amazed about your preliminary results regarding the impact of buprénorphine or methadone on the control of HIV. So I'm wondering if you have like a psychosocial evaluation of the reasons why there may be such a difference. I know that the results are preliminary, so we will see on the long term. And then that's my first question. And then my second question is the fact that you said that some people were, that a reason why they accepted to be included in the trial was that they could get the buprénorphine 3 or 4 times a week, which really helped them to get involved in their work and everyday life. And we are working in Dakar in an OST center, and we've seen that with methadone, you know, when they start on everyday methadone, and then after a few months, they get the methadone for 1 week, and they come back once a week, and they just, you know, they really like that because of all the involvement regarding the work. And so can you tell me how is it with methadone and buprénorphine and the impact on that, on the HIV control at the end?
Yeah, first of all, I need to emphasize that these are preliminary results, and we have not yet done the on-treatment analysis, which I suspect will be very different. And I think the thing to understand that we'll be exploring here in the next few months are the social correlates of retention and care. For example, the #1 reason for loss to follow-up was incarceration and transfer to an O6 center. There was some differential effect in the 2 groups. It's difficult to stay on either antiretroviral therapy or buprénorphine or methadone if you're in jail. And there are many other things that may be at play. We have measures of social support, we have measures of family support that we'll look at as potential correlates as well. So I think there's more to the story. I also think that this was at heart an implementation study in the very messy world of clinical care, which is not where we do most of our research. And I think it may be a small window opening on how difficult that is and what the potential supports are that might improve the quality of care that we deliver, not only in Hanoi, but elsewhere.
Oui, allez-y.
So I just have a question. What is 06 rehab, and are you able to comment on like what the average doses were around for buprenorphine and how that changed when it went to 3 or 4 times a week, and same for methadone?
Right. The average doses were fairly high. For buprenorphine, it was an average of 18 milligrams. For methadone, it was, I think, 110 milligrams. From Dr. Bart's presentation, that may not be enough. And we'll be learning more about that. 06 rehab is the traditional drug treatment system in Vietnam, which is essentially moving someone out of their community to a very, very institutionalized, I'm trying not to use the word prison. It's compulsory by the government, and yes, sorry. It's compulsory re-education. It does not involve any medications, and increasingly, the government of Vietnam recognizes that they're looking for other models besides this, yet it remains popular in many of the provinces.
Okay, so Todd, just to finish, I want just to make a comment on the. We ran a study in Ho Chi Minh where we integrated buprenorphine and methadone within an HIV clinic, and we had very different results. We actually have. Also, we found like 90% retention in methadone, around like 75% in buprenorphine group. We also allowed like every other day dosing on buprenorphine. I think the main components difference is like we added counseling, and a very structured counseling that actually was a very time-consuming and needed a lot of training and support. So Jean-Pierre and Augustin Voisin from BICIA spent a lot of time training the counselor, but we really see like, for us, this was a main point of keeping the patient engaged, and we were able to have a retention and a viral suppression of 92% at 12 months follow-up. For both group methadone and Suboxone. So we really think that it's not only giving medication and every other day, there is a strong component also needed because the family is a strong support, but this could be also a negative support because we found like some loss of follow-up because the family say, oh, now you feel better, so you need to restart working. And of course they restart working, and of course they relapse. So it could be a good influence at the beginning of the treatment to get in treatment and retention, but also bad after 6 months.
Thank you. I've thought a lot about the GOVOP data this week, and looking forward to talking more, hopefully over lunch. We made a specific feasibility decision in northern Vietnam that at the time we launched the study, it was felt that we just simply didn't have the resources in a multi-site trial to implement the vast amount of counseling in a very sophisticated way that's happened at GOVOP, which looks, I think, a lot more like a specialized treatment center now than most HIV clinics, even in the US. And certainly the clinics in Vietnam, in northern Vietnam, didn't have that in place. I think it's actually one of the great questions moving forward that we need to answer in the scientific community, addressing the implementation science question of how do you scale up the appropriate supports and mental health counseling and increase the resources and support available in a scalable way for low and middle income countries.
I think that's not just for resource-limited settings.
I would add rural America. Yes.
Très bien. Eh bien, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. We have to stop now. Et voilà, là, nous devons nous arrêter. Malheureusement, nous n'avons plus le temps. Mais I hope that it's going to trigger discussions during lunchtime. Bye bye.